The rhythm of the heart monitor was the only thing keeping the room from feeling like a tomb. Joanna lay centered in the bed, her breath shallow and hitching against the silence. Every movement cost her a visible effort, mechanical drip of the intravenous line, the fluid moving drop by drop into her arm. The air in the room tasted of cold metal and sterile chemicals, a sharp scent that burned the back of her throat. She tried to lift her hand to adjust the position of her head, but her fingers barely cleared the mattress before falling back, dead weight against the fabric. Her pulse fluttered beneath the thin skin of her wrist, a rapid, frantic beat that betrayed her fatigue. Outside the window, the world moved with a speed that felt impossible, but inside, time had stalled. She was tethered to this bed, the white walls closing in with every passing minute of stillness. She closed her eyes, trying to block out the sterile glow of the ceiling light, waiting for a reprieve that stayed just out of reach. The hallway remained unnervingly quiet, until the distant, heavy sound of footsteps began to echo against the floor tiles, growing steadily louder. The footsteps stopped abruptly. A shadow fell across the frosted glass of the door. Before Joanna could pull her breath into a steady rhythm, the door handle turned with a sharp, metallic snap. It swung inward, hitting the wall with a hollow thud that vibrated through the floorboards. Kane stepped into the room. He did not pause. He did not look at the monitors or the medical equipment lining the walls. His stride was long and heavy, eating up the distance between the threshold and the bedside in 3 rapid paces. He stopped at the foot of the bed, his chest heaving. His jaw set so tightly the muscles along his neck stood out. The air in the room seemed to thin instantly, pushed aside by the sheer force of his arrival. He scanned the room, ignoring the medical staff, his eyes locking onto Joanna with a gaze that held no warmth. He planted his feet wide, bracing himself as if he were preparing for a physical collision. The quiet, sterile peace of the last few hours evaporated, replaced by the sharp, electric tension of his presence. He leaned forward, his hands gripping the metal railing of the bed frame, and the entire structure groaned under the pressure of his weight. He was here, and the room felt suddenly, dangerously small. Kane did not look at Joanna. He turned his head sharply toward the doorway where Dr. Taylor stood, his finger jabbing at the air with rhythmic, violent force. The doctor took a step forward, but Kane moved faster, cutting off the path to the bed. He loomed over the medical cart, his shadow stretching across the floor to touch the edge of the mattress. "Take my wife's blood to save Mrs. Carter," Kane commanded. The words hit the room with the weight of a final judgment. He did not ask. He did not negotiate. He stated the requirement as if it were a simple transaction. His eyes remained fixed on the doctor, daring him to offer a single word of resistance. Joanna watched him from the bed, but he refused to acknowledge her presence, treating her as nothing more than a source of supply. He shifted his weight, his knuckles white as he gripped the back of the visitor chair, pulling it out and slamming it against the floor to emphasize his point. The metal legs scraped harshly against the tiles. He leaned in, lowering his voice into a jagged, while Kane stood his ground, waiting for his will to be carried out without a shred of hesitation. Dr. Taylor moved with deliberate speed, sliding between Kane and the bedside. He planted his heels firmly, his body forming a wall that prevented further advance toward the patient. He held up a hand, palm outward, signaling for a halt. "Sir, stop," the doctor said, his voice dropping into a professional, warning tone. "Your wife is pregnant. This procedure is life-threatening for both of them." The silence that followed was absolute. The monitor beside the bed emitted a steady, rhythmic pulse, the only sound in the room. Kane did not retreat. He recoiled for a split second, his shoulders hitching upward, but then his expression hardened into a mask of cold resolve. He stepped closer. He leaned into the doctor, his voice dropping to a low, serrated edge. "I do not care about the risks." Kane spat, his words hitting the air like physical blows. "Take the blood." He looked past the doctor, his eyes finally landing on the bed, but there was no flicker of concern, only a calculating, predatory glare. He had made his choice, and he was moving forward, regardless of the cost to the life growing within her. Joanna watched the confrontation from the stillness of the bed. Her breathing was shallow, a rhythmic labor that seemed to exhaust her with every cycle. She saw the doctor standing as a shield, and she saw the rigidity in the posture of the man she had loved for years. She believed, despite the coldness radiating from him, that there was still a bridge to be built. She shifted her weight, the movement causing a sharp, stinging sensation to flare in her limbs. She ignored the pain, focusing every ounce of her remaining strength on the space between them. Slowly, she lifted her arm. The motion was jagged, her muscles trembling under the weight of her own body. Her fingers extended, reaching out into the stagnant air of the hospital room. She looked toward him, her lips parting to form a weak, fragile smile. It was an offering, a desperate attempt to pull him back from the edge of his own fury. She kept her hands suspended, fingers slightly curled, waiting for him to see her, waiting for him to acknowledge the life they were supposed to share. Her eyes remained locked on his, filled with a quiet, unwavering hope that refused to break even as the silence in the room stretched and deepened. The air in the room seemed to freeze as Joanna's fingers hovered, inches from his reach. Kane looked down at her hand, his gaze sweeping over her trembling arm with a look of pure, unadulterated revulsion. Before she could bridge the final gap, he lunged backward, jerking his hand away as if her touch carried a searing, toxic heat. He stepped back, his boots scraping sharply against the sterile floor tiles, putting distance between them with frantic, jagged speed. He did not look at her face. He looked through her, his jaw set into a hard, immovable line. "Do not touch me," he barked, the sound cutting through the quiet like a blade. He pointed a finger at her, his hand shaking with a sudden, sharp intensity. "She is the reason Mrs. Carter lost her child," he shouted, his voice echoing against the white walls. "She owes her this. She owes her everything." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Joanna remained frozen, her arms still suspended in the empty space where he had been standing. The reality of his accusation settled over her, thick and suffocating, leaving her completely alone in the center of the room. The accusations echoed until they faded into the hum of the hospital monitors. Joanna watched her own hand, still suspended in the air, its tremor worsening until it became a rhythmic, uncontrollable shaking. She felt the warmth drain from her fingertips, replaced by a creeping numbness that moved up her arm and settled deep into her chest. She curled her fingers slowly, one by one, until her hand formed a tight, white-knuckled fist against the thin, synthetic fabric of the blanket. She pulled her arm back, the movement heavy and uncoordinated, as if she were dragging a lead weight across the bed. The hopeful smile that had lingered on her lips collapsed, the muscles in her face slackening until her expression became a mask of hollow indifference. She did not look at him again. She turned her head, the motion stiff and deliberate, and directed her focus toward the expanse of the white wall. Every detail of the painted surface became a focal point. The slight peeling at the corner, the uneven texture of the plaster, the stark, blinding lack of color. She stared until her eyes burned, refusing to blink, refusing to acknowledge the space where he stood. The silence was no longer a void waiting to be filled. It was a wall, solid and impenetrable, separating her from the world he inhabited. Dr. Taylor stood between them, his posture rigid. He looked from Kane to the monitors, his breath hitching in the quiet room. He reached out, touching the edge of the bed as if to anchor himself. "Sir, your wife is pregnant," he stated, his voice tight and strained. "This procedure carries immense risk. It is life-threatening." Kane did not blink. He stepped closer, crowding the space, his presence forcing the doctor to retreat. The doctor looked toward the window, then back at the sterile equipment tray. He let out a long, shuddering breath that rattled in his throat. His shoulders slumped, the resistance draining out of him as he acknowledged the authority looming over his shoulder. He turned to the nurse, his movements mechanical and stiff. He signaled with a brief, downward nod of his head. He reached for the tray, his fingers hovering over the cold steel instruments before he selected the needle. He moved toward the bedside with measured, heavy steps. Joanna did not flinch as he approached. She remained still, eyes fixed on the wall, as he cleared the space beside her. The sound of the plastic packaging tearing open was the only noise in the room, sharp and final. He lowered his head, avoiding her gaze, and prepared the sight. The inevitable had arrived. The nurse moved the second bed until it was flush against the first. Joanna lay motionless, her breathing shallow and ragged, while Mrs. Carter settled into the space beside her with deliberate grace. The room fell into a heavy, suffocating stillness. Mrs. Carter leaned over, her shoulder brushing against Joanna's arm. She tilted her head, her lips curling into a sharp, jagged grin. She spoke in a whisper that cut through the silence like a razor. "I am not even sick, you know," she murmured, her voice vibrating with a low, cruel laugh. She leaned back, pressing her palms against the mattress, and let out a soft, mocking chuckle that filled the space between them. Joanna felt the words land like stones. She kept her eyes closed, the lids trembling, refusing to give the woman the satisfaction of a response. Her body felt impossibly heavy, pinned to the sterile sheets by a weight that had nothing to do with her condition. She squeezed her fingers into the fabric, knuckles turning translucent against the skin. She could hear the rustle of pillows as Mrs. Carter shifted, relishing the power she held in the silence. Joanna retreated further into herself, shutting out the sound of the laughter, while the hum of the hospital equipment seemed to grow louder, drowning out the world. Dr. Taylor stood between the two beds, a silver tray balanced in his hands. He looked down at the needle, his knuckles white against the metal. The air in the room felt thin, pulled tight by the expectation of the coming action. He glanced at Joanna, but she remained a statue, her gaze fixed on the ceiling. Across the small gap, the scene was entirely different. Kane hovered over Mrs. Carter, his body angled to shield her from the rest of the room. He reached down, his hands moving with meticulous care as he fluffed the pillows and smoothed the sheets around her. He did not look at the doctor. He did not look at the needle. He did not look at the woman lying only inches away from his charge. Mrs. Carter watched the doctor with a steady, expectant gaze, her posture relaxed and smug. The doctor took a half step toward Joanna, the metal of the needle glinting under the fluorescent lights. He drew a sharp breath, his jaw set in a hard line. He reached out to adjust the position of Joanna's arm, his touch clinical and devoid of warmth. The room fell into a total, heavy silence. Every eye in the room turned toward the small, sharp point of the instrument. The moment hung, suspended, vibrating with the weight of what was about to happen. The tip of the needle touched her skin. It did not slide in easily. Dr. Taylor paused, his hand shaking, pressing just enough to create a small dimple in the flesh. Joanna held her breath until her ribs ached, her entire frame locked in a rigid, desperate attempt to remain still. The metal pushed harder. The skin gave way with a sharp, searing resistance. A single bead of red welled up at the point of entry, violent movement that strained the IV lines. A ragged, thin cry tore from her throat, echoing against the sterile walls. It was a sound, stripped of all restraint, raw and jagged with the shock of the intrusion. Her fingers clawed at the sheets, bunching the fabric until her joints popped. She turned her head toward the wall, squeezing her eyes shut, but the sensation of the needle moving beneath her skin was unavoidable. She let out another breath, this one a broken sob, as the pressure continued. The room seemed to tilt, the fluorescent hum sharpening into a high, discordant buzz. She pulled against the restraints, but the weight of the moment held her firmly in place, forcing her to endure the slow, methodical drain. The crimson liquid began to pulse through the clear tube, a steady rhythm of loss. Joanna did not scream again. She simply stared at the ceiling, her chest rising in shallow, jagged increments. Her hand lay limp against the mattress, the skin around the needle turning a bruised shade of purple. Across the narrow divide, the atmosphere was thick with a different kind of intensity. Kane did not glance at the blood. He did not check the monitor recording Joanna's plummeting pulse. His focus was entirely on Mrs. Carter. He reached out to adjust the pillows behind her head, his palms soft, his movements slow and deliberate. He checked the seal on her water glass and wiped a stray drop from her cheek with the back of his hand. Mrs. Carter watched him with a thin, triumphant smile, her body relaxed against the support he provided. Kane leaned in close, whispering something that made her laugh, a sharp, clear sound that cut through the sterile hum of the room. He stood there, his back to his wife, shielding Mrs. Carter from the sight of the medical procedure. He remained motionless, his posture guarding the woman who had caused this, while the life drained from the person he had vowed to protect. The contrast was absolute. The room dimmed as Joanna's vision blurred at the edges. She tried to lift her head, but her neck muscles failed to respond, leaving her cheek pressed hard against the pillow. Her lungs felt heavy, as if filled with lead, making every inhalation a deliberate, monumental effort. She opened her mouth, intending to utter a single word of protest, but only a dry, rattling breath escaped. Her lips remained parted, trembling, then fell slack. Across the partition, the soft clink of metal instruments signaled the progress of the procedure. Kane stood unmoving, his eyes fixed on the collection bag filling with Joanna's life force. He did not blink. He did not offer a touch. He simply watched the volume rise with the detached calculation of a bookkeeper. Joanna felt the cold spread from her fingertips toward her heart. She closed her eyes to shut out the side of his back, the broad shoulders that once offered safety now serving as a barrier. Her fingers, resting on the thin blanket, curled into small, tight fists before finally going limp. The fight drained out of her, leaving behind a hollow silence. She stopped pulling against the restraints. She stopped resisting the weight of the needle. She simply drifted, eyes shut, existing in the thinning space between consciousness and the encroaching dark. The suction stopped with a soft, final click. Dr. Taylor pulled the needle free, pressing a wad of gauze against the puncture site with a trembling hand. He looked at Joanna, then up at Kane, his face etched with unspoken condemnation. Kane did not look down. He moved to the other side of the room, his gait steady and purposeful. He reached for a glass of water, held it to Mrs. Carter's lips, and watched her sip with a satisfied, almost proprietary air. Joanna lay still, her skin a translucent gray, her breathing barely visible beneath the thin covers. She was a ghost in her own bed. When the nurse moved to check her vitals, Kane stepped in the way, his hand firm on the nurse's arm. "She is fine," he stated, his voice devoid of doubt. "She has paid her debt." He turned back to Mrs. Carter, shielding her with his frame as if protecting a saint. He remained in that position, his expression set in stone, convinced that his actions were not just necessary, but virtuous. He ignored the monitor's erratic beep, ignored the silence from the bed behind him, and focused entirely on the woman he believed was his victim. The room was cold, quiet, and suffocating, anchored by his unwavering, misplaced belief in his own justice. The sterile air of the room remained stale for days. Joanna moved through the motions of her recovery with a mechanical, detached precision. She avoided looking at the door. She avoided looking at the chair where he used to sit. When he finally returned, he brought with him the same arrogance that had defined his presence for months. He sat at the small table, tapping his fingers against the wood, waiting for her to acknowledge his arrival. Joanna did not look up. She reached into the folder resting on her lap and pulled out a stack of heavy, white paper. She placed them flat on the table, her hands steady, and pushed them toward him with a single, fluid motion. The sound of the paper sliding across the wood was the only noise in the room. Kane stopped tapping. He looked down at the document, his brow furrowing as he read the bold heading. Joanna stood up, her movements deliberate. She did not raise her voice. She did not explain. She simply watched his face tighten as the reality of the situation took hold. The paper sat between them, a barrier more permanent than any wall. She had stopped pleading for understanding. She had stopped waiting for his approval. She was reclaiming the space he had spent months trying to destroy. Kane shoved the papers aside, the sound of tearing edges sharp against the quiet. He rose from his chair, his shadow stretching across the floor as he moved to block her path. Joanna did not flinch. She reached for a single bag resting near the bed, her grip firm on the handle. She walked past him, her eyes fixed on the threshold, not the man who stood in her way. Kane barked a command, his voice echoing off the sterile walls, but the words held no weight. She stepped into the hallway, her stride rhythmic and unbroken. Every step toward the exit was a reclamation of the space she had lost. She reached the door, placed her hand on the cold handle, and twisted. The lock clicked. She pulled it open, the sudden rush of outside air cutting through the stagnant heat of the room. Kane remained in the center of the space, his hands balled into fists. Watching the distance grow between them, she did not look back. She crossed the porch, her boots hitting the concrete with a steady, final beat. The door swung shut behind her, the latch catching with a definitive, metallic snap. She was gone, and the house fell into a hollow, sudden silence. The silence in the room was not empty. To Kane, it was a reprieve. He paced the floor, his boots clicking against the hardwood, and stopped at the window to watch the driveway. It was vacant. He turned back to the room, his jaw set in a line of forced composure. He convinced himself that her exit was merely a tactic, a calculated play for attention that would inevitably collapse under the weight of her own dependence. He walked to the kitchen and poured a glass of water, his hand steady, his breathing rhythmic. He moved a chair back to its original position, smoothing the fabric where she had sat. He was meticulously erasing the space she had occupied, replacing the memory of her existence with the rigid structure of his own ego. He stood in the center of the living area, arms crossed, surveying the order he had restored. He did not check the locks. He did not call out. He simply waited for the world to apologize for the inconvenience of her absence. He felt no doubt. He felt no shadow of guilt. He remained anchored in the conviction that he was the victim of an ungrateful whim, unaware that the floor beneath his feet was already beginning to fracture. The heavy thud of boots on the porch signaled a shift in the atmosphere. Two men in dark coats moved past the threshold, their eyes scanning the room with clinical precision. Mrs. Carter stood by the mantel, her hands trembling as she clutched a lace handkerchief. She stepped forward, attempting to block their path to the stairs, her voice thin and high. The lead investigator did not acknowledge her presence, instead pulling a notebook from his pocket and recording the dimensions of the hallway. He moved to the landing, tracing the line of the floorboards with a gloved finger. Mrs. Carter followed, her composure fraying at the edges as she repeated a rehearsed story about a fall. The investigator stopped, turned, and tilted his head. He did not ask a question. He simply pointed to the dust patterns on the floor, undisturbed and thick. The second officer began opening drawers, methodically cataloging documents and medical records. Mrs. Carter's breath hitched, her eyes darting between the men as they systematically tore down her carefully constructed timeline. Every movement they made was deliberate, cold, and stripped of the empathy she expected. The air in the house grew tight, pressurized by the weight of incoming truth. She reached out to touch the investigator's arm, but he stepped back, leaving her hand grasping empty air. The investigation had begun, and the walls were finally starting to close in. The laptop screen flickered to life on the kitchen island. A video file played a clear, high-definition loop of the hallway. Mrs. Carter walked perfectly upright. No fall, no stumble, no injury. The lead investigator clicked the mouse, freezing the frame on her face. Kane leaned in, his eyes locking onto the screen. He saw the truth in the lack of motion. There was no tumble, there was no pain. Just a woman walking down a hallway with a cold, calculated gait. Kane reached out to slam the laptop shut, but an officer stepped in, pressing a firm hand against his chest to hold him back. He stumbled, hitting the edge of the counter, his breath hitching in his throat. The investigator scrolled to the next file. Medical reports, cleared of any record of trauma. Kane stared at the evidence, his mind struggling to bridge the gap between his long-held conviction and the undeniable reality displayed before him. The foundation of his rage turned to dust. His hands, once clenched in defense of a lie, went slack. He looked at the empty seat where Joanna used to sit, the silence of the room now heavy with the weight of his own monstrous error. The truth did not set him free. It dismantled his world piece by piece, leaving him standing in the wreckage of a reality he had built on nothing but a hollow deception. The lead investigator did not wait for a response. He signaled the second officer, who stepped toward Mrs. Carter with steel cuffs ready. She recoiled, her back hitting the kitchen wall with a sharp, hollow sound. As the cold metal clicked around her wrists, the mask of the fragile victim finally shattered. She stopped trembling. She stopped pleading. Instead, a jagged, manic laugh tore through the room. She twisted her body, fighting the grip of the officers, her eyes locking onto Kane with a terrifying intensity. She threw her head back, her voice rising into a shrill, desperate shriek that echoed against the ceiling. "I did it all for you, Kane," she screamed, the words vibrating with a toxic, possessive fervor. "Everything I did was to keep you looking at me. Only at me," she thrashed, her boots scuffing the floorboards as the police dragged her toward the threshold. She did not look at the officers. She stared only at him, her face contorted in a mask of warped devotion. The front door swung open, admitting a slice of harsh daylight. They hauled her out onto the porch, her frantic cries trailing off into the distance as the house plunged back into a sudden, suffocating quiet. The sound of the departing police cruiser faded into the distance, leaving the house in a silence so profound it felt like pressure against his eardrums. Kane remained frozen in the center of the kitchen, his hands still trembling. The air in the room felt thin, drained of oxygen. He looked at the chair where Mrs. Carter had sat for weeks, the wood still warm from her presence, and felt a wave of nausea rise in his throat. He did not move toward the door. He did not follow. He turned his back on the exit, his movements stiff and mechanical. The silence was no longer a reprieve. It was a verdict. He walked to the kitchen island, his fingertips brushing the granite where the laptop had revealed the truth. Every memory of his past months now tasted like ash. He saw the empty house not as a home, but as a hollowed-out monument to his own arrogance. His chest tightened, a cold ache radiating outward, anchoring him to the floor. He stared at his own reflection in the darkened window, seeing a stranger whose hands were stained by a betrayal he could never undo. He was alone, and for the first time he understood that there was no one left to blame but himself. Kane did not stay in the kitchen. He moved through the house with a sudden, jagged urgency, as if the walls themselves were closing in. He reached the bedroom, pulling open drawers he had not touched in months. He found a small, silver hair clip caught in the corner of a vanity drawer. He gripped it until the metal bit into his palm. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He had driven away the only person who had ever looked at him with genuine care. He threw his suitcase onto the bed, slamming it open. He began to pack, not with purpose, but with a blind, frantic energy. He swept papers, photographs, and contact lists from the desk into his bag. He needed to find her. He needed to undo the wreckage. He ran downstairs, his keys clattering against the wood. He burst through the front door and sprinted to his car, his breath hitching in his throat. He did not know where she had gone, but he knew he could not stop until he found her. He slammed the car door, started the engine, and pulled away from the curb, leaving the house behind as he began the first, desperate mile of a search that would define the rest of his life. The map on the wall became a graveyard of failed leads. Kane moved from city to city, his life distilled into transit lounges and nameless hotel rooms. He crossed borders with the desperation of a man running from his own shadow. In the first year, he sold his luxury vehicles. By the third, he liquidated his property holdings. He spent his fortune on private investigators who took his money and returned with nothing. Each new location was a carbon copy of the last, sterile, temporary, and empty. He stopped sleeping in beds, preferring the cramped corners of trains where he could track his progress on paper charts. His face grew gaunt, the skin tightening over his cheekbones, his eyes perpetually rimmed with exhaustion. He watched his bank balance dwindle, each transaction a nail in the coffin of his former status. He did not care. He traded his stability for a memory, chasing a ghost across 3 continents. The seasons blurred into a single, relentless cycle of arrival and departure. Every time he stepped off a plane, his heart hammered against his ribs, expecting to see her face in the crowd. Every time, the crowd dispersed, and he was left standing alone on the pavement. 5 years bled into one another, leaving him with nothing but a suitcase of photographs and a growing, hollow obsession. The search had stripped Kane down to his barest bones. He sat in a cramped, roadside diner, his hands trembling as he gripped a lukewarm cup of coffee. He caught his reflection in the darkened window. The man staring back was unrecognizable. His hair was streaked with gray, his shoulders hunched under the weight of an invisible burden. He traced the lines around his eyes, deep furrows carved by years of frantic, fruitless transit. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a stack of banking statements, each one showing a final, zeroed-out balance. The money was gone. His influence had vanished. He leaned back, his head hitting the wall with a dull thud. There was no longer a home to return to, and no destination that offered peace. He had become a ghost in his own life, tethered to the world only by the singular, crushing weight of his past actions. He looked at the map spread across the table, the routes now meaningless scribbles on frayed paper. He let the paper slide to the floor. He did not pick it up. He simply sat in the dim light, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, finally understanding that the silence in the room was the only thing he had successfully earned. A single envelope arrived at the motel desk, forwarded through a dozen defunct agencies. It contained one address, typed on a scrap of yellowed paper. Kane did not check the postmark. He shoved his remaining belongings into a bag and left the room without looking back. He drove for 3 days, his focus narrowing until the world outside the windshield ceased to exist. He navigated through winding suburban streets, the engine ticking as he slowed to a crawl. The houses here were small, well-kept, broken only by the settling metal of the cooling engine. He stepped out, his joints stiff from the long drive. His boots crunched on the gravel driveway. He walked toward the front door, his breath hitching in his chest. A children's bicycle lay on the grass, half hidden by a sprawling hedge. He stopped at the gate, his hand hovering over the latch. The house looked peaceful, the windows reflecting the afternoon sun. He took a steadying breath, wiped the sweat from his palms, and reached for the doorbell. He stood on the porch, waiting, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The door groaned on its hinges as it began to swing outward. Kane braced himself, his fingers curling into his palms, ready for a reaction, a scream, a strike, or even a tearful collapse. The door opened wide. Joanna stood in the entryway, framed by the dim light of the hallway. She did not recoil, she did not gasp. She simply stood, her weight balanced evenly, her hands resting at her sides. Her face was a landscape of neutrality, devoid of the hurt or the fury he had spent 5 years memorizing. She looked at him as if he were a stranger asking for directions on a busy street. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Kane opened his mouth, the prepared apologies dying in his throat before he could utter a sound. He searched her eyes for a flicker of recognition, for the woman who had once reached for him in the hospital, but there was nothing. The connection he had relied upon to justify his long, ruinous journey had evaporated. She existed in a world that no longer included him. She did not move to close the door, yet she occupied the space with a finality that made him feel as though he were standing on the other side of an ocean. He was a ghost, and she had long ago moved on. Kane stumbled forward, his knees hitting the porch wood with a dull, sharp thud. He fumbled with the heavy bags he had carried from the car, setting them down with frantic, jerky motions. He pulled out wrapped boxes, his hands shaking so violently he nearly dropped them. He pushed the gifts toward the threshold, his head bowed, his voice cracking as he began to pour out the apologies he had rehearsed for thousands of miles. He spoke of the money spent, the borders crossed, and the years lost in the pursuit of his own redemption. He looked up, expecting to see the reflection of his own guilt in her eyes. Instead, he saw nothing. Joanna's gaze remained fixed on the horizon beyond his shoulder, her pupils unmoving. She did not look at the gifts. She did not look at his face. Her features remained locked in a mask of total, terrifying detachment. She was not angry. She was not forgiving. She was simply finished. The weight of his words vanished into the open air, unacknowledged and unheeded. He reached out to touch her hand, but she pulled back with a subtle, fluid motion, turning her body away to retreat into the shadows of the house. He stayed on the floor, the boxes sitting uselessly between them. Kane remained on the porch, his fingers gripping the splintered wood of the floorboards. He prepared to speak again, to beg for another moment, when the sound of boots hitting the porch stopped him cold. A boy stepped out from the darkness of the hallway, moving with a deliberate, steady stride that mirrored the finality Joanna had just displayed. He stood between Kane and the open door, his posture rigid. He was 10 years old, yet he held his ground with the weight of a man twice his size. Kane looked up, his jaw slack, his hands still trembling near the discarded gifts. The boy stared down at him, his face devoid of the curiosity or fear Kane had expected to find. The silence was broken only by the boy's sharp, rhythmic breathing. He stood firm, a living barricade of muscle and resolve. "If you had not abused Mom, maybe you would have been in my life," the boy said. The words hit the space between them like stones. There was no tremor in the boy's voice, no hesitation. He had clearly defined the boundary of his world, and Kane was firmly on the outside. Every excuse Kane had built over 5 years of searching collapsed under the weight of that single damning sentence. He reached out, his hand hovering inches from the boy's shoulder, seeking some form of connection or acknowledgement. Cameron did not flinch. He did not blink. He watched Kane's hand with a detached, clinical focus, then stepped backward, drawing the edge of the heavy wooden door into his grip. The wood groaned under the pressure of his small, firm hands. Kane scrambled to his feet, his boots sliding against the porch boards, his eyes wide as he realized the shift in momentum. He took a desperate half-step forward, his palm outstretched, but Cameron's gaze remained fixed and unyielding. The boy pulled the door inward. It moved with a slow, deliberate weight, slicing through the air between them. Kane lunged, his fingers grasping at the air, but he was too late. The door swung home with a deafening, final thud. The latch clicked a sharp, metallic sound that echoed through the quiet yard. Cameron was gone. The porch was empty. The barrier between them was now absolute, solid, and utterly immovable. Kane stood motionless on the porch. The wood under his feet felt cold, damp from the evening mist. He stared at the painted surface of the door, waiting for the latch to click again, for the wood to creak, or for a voice to call him back. Nothing happened. The house settled into a deep, heavy stillness. He turned, his boots scraping against the concrete as he stepped down onto the pavement. He did not walk away. He stood at the edge of the property, his hands hanging limp at his sides. The streetlights flickered to life, casting long, sharp shadows across the driveway. He looked up at the windows, but they remained dark and impenetrable. A breeze moved through the trees, stirring the dry leaves around his ankles, but it was the only movement in the world. He reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing against the gifts he had brought, then let his hand drop. The weight of the silence pressed against him, thick and suffocating. He realized then that the lock had not just closed a door, but had ended a chapter that could never be rewritten. He stayed there. As the night deepened, a solitary figure anchored to the ground, surrounded by the hollow echo of his own past mistakes.